Hello and a very good day. Uh, a very good morning to all of you. Now, I would like to apologize for the 1 or 2 minute delay because we're all working from home and I'm having some internet connectivity issues. But I guess everything is okay now. And I would like to thank you all for joining in. Thank you so much for taking out the time today. And thank you for being a part of today's webinar. Now, before I go ahead and jump into today's webinar, I would like to run a quick audio and a video check because my home connection is pretty weak, it's intermittent, and I would like to make sure that everybody out here today is able to hear me and is able to see the screen well. So I'll quickly start off with an audio check. If you can hear my voice, if my voice is well and audible without any distortion, just use the chat box in front of you to give me a confirmation. Just say yes, just say okay using the chat box in front of you and confirm if you can hear my voice well and clear. Just a few confirmations, guys, before I jump into today's webinar. Perfect, looks like everything is good. If you can see my screen, that's the title, Choosing the Right Enterprise IAM Strategy for Active Directory and Azure Active Directory, and my email ID, just give me another confirmation. Thank you so much, Ray. Thank you so much for your response. All right, now before we go ahead and jump in, I would like to tell you that the entire session today is being recorded and the recording would reach to you on your email post the webinar. So if you've got any questions, use the Q&A tab in front of you and keep punching in your questions. And I promise I will take the answers to your questions towards the end of the webinar. And if you have any questions later in the day post the webinar, you can always drop an email to me at abi@manageengine.com. That's abi@manageengine.com. And I would be more than happy to help you. All right, without further ado, let's go ahead and begin. But before we begin, a word of caution. If the video cuts out or if you lose on the audio, just let me know using the chat box or the Q&A tab, and I'll do my best to get it fixed right away. So today's webinar's topic is choosing the right enterprise IAM strategy for Active Directory and Azure Active Directory. Now, why did I choose to speak about this topic today? And why am I talking about identity and access management, right? So identity and access management is a buzzword that has been around for a very, very long time, right? Be it on-premises infrastructures like Active Directory, or when you're adopting cloud infrastructures like Azure Active Directory or Amazon Web Services or anything of that sort, you would have heard of the buzzword or the jargon or the term identity and access management. Right? So identity and access management is not new. This is a buzzword, a term, a problem that has been existent from a long, long time, right from on-premises infrastructures and all the way into the cloud. And today we are going to try and adopt an IAM model, an identity and access management model that supports your on-premises infrastructures, namely Active Directory and Azure Active Directory. Right? So why is identity and access management so important, and why do enterprises and IT security advisors often advise about having a strong IAM foundation, right? Why does it play such a crucial role in enterprises? So IAM is basically an enterprise IT solution, right? That defines what your users can do, right? That defines the roles of your users, what your users can access, which resources your users can access. So if we break it down, right, the IAM strategy can be divided into three important parts. Number one is do the right users have access to the right resources, right? Number two is, are there systems in place to manage access? And number three, what are the users doing with the access that they have? Are the users' access activities monitored well? Right, so that's the whole point of an IAM, to understand what your IT environment is all about, to gain visibility on your IT environment, to set up efficient management activities in your IT environment, and last but not the least, to know what's happening in your IT environment with the access that is granted to your end users and the employees in your organization. An identity and access management solution is no longer a mere security project. It's about protecting your information, your data, and majorly being fully aware of what's happening in your organization. So let's take a look at today's agenda. We'll take a look at the current state of IT in most enterprises, right? And then we'll take a look at how does an identity and access management solution, right? How does a strong identity and access management solution or an IAM solution actually affect you? The third part of today's webinar, we'll take a look at the security implications of an improper IAM model. The fourth part of today's webinar, we'll take a look at the top IAM challenges that most heterogeneous enterprises face. By heterogeneous here, I mean enterprises that use hybrid solutions, right? A combination of on-prem and cloud. And last but not the least, we will employ a phased approach for efficient identity and access management in Active Directory and Azure Active Directory. So the current state of IT in most enterprises, what's happening? As you can see, enterprises are increasingly adopting cloud solutions, right? Namely, public cloud solutions are more sought after than private cloud solutions. And as you can see from the graph right here, Amazon Web Services is leading and Azure is not very far away. Azure is quickly catching up to being the most adopted public cloud solution in organizations, right? It's not like the olden times where data only used to be stored on-premise infrastructures or traditional on-premise Active Directory, but now data and workloads are split across infrastructures, right? On-premise and cloud. So according to the statistics that were released in 2020, majority of the data, right, is split into two halves, and half of the data is on on-premise infrastructures, and the other half, namely 48%, is on the public cloud. So almost 60% of an organization's workload can easily be assumed to be on a public cloud infrastructure like Azure Active Directory, right? So what does this mean to you? How does a hybrid infrastructure affect you as an organization or as an enterprise or as an IT department? Now, the problem here is that identities are everywhere, right? Identities are widespread, permissions are widespread, and it's just not on-premise anymore. Like I said, there are a multitude of cloud applications. There are an assortment of cloud applications that are now introduced into our traditional on-premise infrastructures. So in a nutshell, the end result here is that there are many users, right? There are many permissions, and the permissions are widespread across applications that are on-premise, applications that are on the cloud, and are widespread across devices, right? And the old problem always comes in where IAM was always hard to enforce. IAM was not an easy task to do, but now with the introduction of cloud, the problem is slowly expanding, right? So what are the security implications of an improper IAM model, right? So again, I'm beating around the bush again. I'm talking about IAM, the buzzword that's frequently used, but what is IAM all about? IAM is all about defining a secure authentication and an authorization policy for your organization, right? Your users must be authenticated securely, and the permissions, privileges, access controls, user rights, whatever you may call it, that are granted to your security objects must be authorized and must be within the security boundaries, right? So let me illustrate this using an example, right? Let's consider the typical user onboarding process, right? So let's say your users are onboarded today. You are a system administrator, I presume, and you would get a call from your HR manager asking you to onboard close to 100 users, right? So you get a call today, you start onboarding your users, and it's but natural that during the course of the time, during the course of the user's life cycle, there will be many permission changes. There will be many authorization changes. The user's rights will be modified because the user over time will need access to different resources, right? And last but not the least, when the user leaves the organization or when the user leaves the enterprise, access must be revoked. Access is generally revoked. This is a typical user lifecycle in an organization, right? The user comes in, has permission changes, access changes over time, and once the user leaves the enterprise, the access rights must be revoked. This is a typical cycle in most organizations, right? But here is where most of us make mistakes. For instance, when you onboard a user, what if the user is granted broad access, right? What if a user is granted access that he or she needs, but just a little bit more than that, right? And over the user's life cycle, over the user's time within the organization, like I said, there will be permission changes, right? And what if the permission changes were not documented, were not authorized, right? And with the privileges or with the permissions that the user has, what if the activity of that user was not monitored? And last but not the least, once the user is offboarded, what if the access rights of the user were not purged completely? Right? As you can see, there are many steps that happen right from when a user or a resource comes into an organization or leaves an organization, and every step of it is important to ensure security, and that is why you need a strong IAM model. And like I said, the problem extends from on-premise to the cloud. And another important thing that we need to take in concern here is building on security alone will not work, right? We need to maintain a balance between enterprise security and user productivity, right? So we can go about building on security, but at the end, if our end users are not comfortable, or if our end users are annoyed by the security protocols that we have set up, that in itself could be a security threat, right? So these are a few, this is just one example of how an improper IAM model can affect your organization. But let's take a look at a few challenges of an improper IAM model in enterprises. Number one is that there are too many user identities, right? Like I said, an on-premise identity can be one. On-premise applications typically have another identity. If you have a cloud solution like Azure Active Directory, your user will have another identity for Office 365. And similarly, if you use multiple cloud applications, a single user will have multiple identities, right? And the problem is that most of these resources in a hybrid environment, in an environment where there is a combination of on-prem and cloud, are siloed, right? What do I mean by siloed resources? For example, Active Directory has its own set of components to manage, administer, supervise, or monitor, right? Azure Active Directory has its own set of components, namely the Azure Active Directory portal or PowerShell, right? The problem with such an approach is that most of these tools or most of the components in a hybrid environment work on the basis of silos. They have their own tools, they have their own interface to manage them or work with them. There is no centralized interface. There is no unified interface, right? Which brings me to my second problem. This makes the process very diverse, right? For instance, a simple user provisioning activity that I need to do across Active Directory, on-premise Exchange, or Azure Active Directory or Office 365, I will need to shift between multiple tools, right? And let's say I need to do the provisioning activity for 100 users. Imagine the number of times as an administrator, I need to shift between multiple tools. I need to repeat the process over and over again just so I can get the job done. A simple task such as user provisioning, right? Number third is pretty obvious. Different applications, different distributions, namely on-premise and cloud distributions. So the authentication, authorization, and administration policies are completely different, right? Active Directory is used to authenticate and authorize only your in-house resources or your on-premise resources, while Azure Active Directory has a separate authentication and authorization method for cloud resources, right? Number four is that there is an explosion of devices. Like I said, users have their own smartphones, they have their own laptops, they have their own computers and their tablets, and the lack of a centralized model right? For identity and access management for Azure Active Directory and Active Directory makes the process extremely complex because you need to shift between tools. There is no one place where you can view permissions, you can manage permissions, you can give permissions, or even you can revoke permissions, right? Number 5 is that there are inconsistent password security levels across systems, meaning your on-premise resources will adhere to Active Directory's password policy. Your Azure Active Directory has its own password security level. If you have a Salesforce application, Salesforce will have its own password policies or password security patterns, right? That brings me to my last point, compliance visibility. Who has access to what? Now, when your users, your permissions, your resources are widespread across an infrastructure, across on-premise and cloud infrastructures, determining who has access to what, right? What are the users doing with the access? Things like that become extremely difficult. So where would you start? Right now, the reason I chose Active Directory and Azure Active Directory is because they go hand in hand. Active Directory is used by most of the organizations. I'm pretty sure you must be using it too to provision access to your on-premise resources. And now, because the organizations are slowly shifting to the cloud, Azure Active Directory is also increasingly being used, right? Because Azure Active Directory is also by Microsoft, offers support for Active Directory, has 28 data centers around the world. So Azure Active Directory is the go-to choice when enterprises adopt a cloud solution, right? Because Azure Active Directory supports applications like Office 365, Microsoft Teams, OneDrive, you name it, right? So when you start implementing an IAM solution, the question comes up, where would you need to start? Would you start on-premise? Would you start cloud? Where would you actually start and how would the process be, right? And because the workload, like I said, is equally spread across on-premise and cloud infrastructures, it's absolutely important to give equal priority, right? So we will employ a 3-step approach or a phased approach for efficient identity and access management. So the first approach that we are going to employ here is a way to gain visibility on the current state of IT, right? My first question that I posed in the introduction, do the right users have access to the right resources? Now, how would we determine that? By gaining visibility. Because if you do not have sufficient visibility on your infrastructure, if you do not know what's happening in the first place, how would you secure access to the resources? Right, so the first step is visibility, and we will try and obtain visibility through a phased approach. First, we'll start off with our on-premise Active Directory, and then we'll move on to our Azure Active Directory. So the typical places where permissions are given in on-premise Active Directory are on the screen, right? And object property values or attribute values, for instance, group memberships of a particular user, group membership of a particular group, or any security object with an Active Directory, right? So group membership, password statuses, log on time of the account, log on hour of the account, which workstations is the user allowed to log on to, right? So that's the first point here. Every property of an object is important because the property can potentially give access to resources. For instance, group membership property or the attribute of an object will determine which groups the object is a member of, right? Terminal service properties will determine which remote systems the user can access. The log on to attribute will determine which workstations or which servers the user can actually log on to, right? So monitoring the attributes or the properties of security objects on our on-prem resources is priority, and that's what we'll start with doing. Number 2 is we need to monitor our on-premise applications, right? Applications such as Exchange that are typically used in on-premise environments, applications such as G Suite, right? So when we use on-premise applications, there are a few things you need to look into as well. For instance, which of your users have mailboxes? Which of your users have administrative roles within Exchange? Which of your users are members of distribution groups, right? This is in accordance to on-premise applications. And last but not the least, we need to look into our data, right? Because data is our gold. Data is our organization's currency, and it's important, or it's priority, that we need to look into our data as well. For instance, your file servers, right? Where is data stored on your file servers, and which of your users have access to that data? Any access, be it read access, write access, modify access, you will need to determine that, right? And also explicit access on objects. Objects such as groups, organizational units, domain controllers, member servers. Which of your users can access the security objects? Which of your users have explicit permissions on security objects, and what can they do on those objects? Right? So for on-prem, these are the three things that I would like you to start off with. Number one is to watch your user attribute values, your object attribute values. Number two is to watch your on-premise applications such as Exchange. And number three is to watch your data, right? Data stored on your file servers, or even permissions on your security objects, such as groups, organizational units, users, servers, domain controllers, you name it, right? So how would we go about doing this with native Active Directory? Let me quickly show you an example right here. If I remote into my VM, right, you can see I am in my VM right here, and I've joined to my VM. And as you may already know, this is the ADUC console for on-premise Active Directory. Right? Now let me just, I want to find out which of my users have domain admin memberships, right? Or I want to find out the group memberships of all the users in my domain. So how would I do that? I'll have to open this up, take a user, right click on the user, head into properties, and select the member of tab. And the groups here will determine which groups my users have access to, and the groups have access to resources, obviously, in our on-premise infrastructure, and we could reverse track down the access from there, right? But the problem here is that there is no centralized interface for you to view group memberships. Let's say I have 100 users on my domain, right? I have a small domain, it's my test domain, so I have 100 users. If I have to determine the membership of 100 users, all I have to do is open up ADUC, check the member of tab for each of those 100 users, right? Now let's say I want to find out when my user's password was last set, right? I want to find that out. So all I have to do is open up the user properties again, head into attribute editor, and select the password last set attribute. But how would I determine this for all the users in my domain? Because we are system administrators or help desk technicians, right? We do not have the time to do this manually, right? So what do we do then? We Google on the internet and we get a PowerShell script and we run the script hoping it would work. But the truth is, scripts don't always do what they claim to do. Scripts can bring in unwanted changes. Script can make modifications to objects or resources on your on-prem environment that you may be unaware of. And scripts can also be malicious, right? 95% of PowerShell scripts that are on the internet are malicious. So let's say you download a script to find out the group membership of all users. And what if the script installs a malware on your registry? So every time people log on to the system, the malware is executed, and that could potentially be a credential attack where the user's passwords are passed on to an attacker system that has a network sniffer installed, right? It's just an example. But the whole point here is that scripts are insecure, scripts can bring in unwanted changes, and the tool is too repetitive, it's too cumbersome, right? There is no easy way for you to find out bulk permissions, for you to gain visibility on bulk objects on your on-premise environment using the tools that are built into the system, like the ADUC tool, right? Number two is the Exchange Admin Center. As you can see, I have an Exchange Admin Center open here. So if I have to find out which of my users have mailboxes, I'll have to jump into the recipients tab and watch out the mailboxes that my users potentially have. Right? I can't do this from Active Directory. I can't do this using the Active Directory users and computers tool, but I'll have to do it using this tool, namely the Exchange Admin Center. Right? Number three, it was permissions. Like I said, if you can recollect, the third part was permissions on your files and folders. So how will I find out the permissions that my users have on all files and folders in my organization. The only way to do that would be to open up a particular file and folder, right click on it, click on properties, security tab, and as you may know, this is how I can check permissions for users across all file servers, right? All files and folders across my servers in my infrastructure. There is no easy way to go about this. You can always use scripting again, but scripts are not always accurate with the information they provide, and scripts can bring in unwanted changes that you may totally be unaware of, right? So the reason I showed you the native tools here is to just put forth one point. Using the native tools is very difficult, meaning the process is very repetitive. The tools have limited capabilities, and you will have to toggle between multiple tools multiple times to find out what's happening within your IT infrastructure or to gain visibility in the first place, right? So let's take a look at how we could gain insights or gain sufficient visibility on our on-premise infrastructure with Manage Engine 8360. Now, what is 8360? For those of you who are new to this, 8360 is our bundled solution where we offer everything right from management to auditing to password self-service, and the list simply goes on, right? So 8360 has a lot of components like you can see right here, but you can pick and choose the components that you need. For instance, AD Manager Plus here manages your Active Directory and your on-premise resources. AD Auditing is used for monitoring. Self-service is used to manage passwords for your hybrid environments. So you can just choose the modules, purchase 8360, and you would be good to go. Now, before I actually tell you more about 8360, let's see how we can gain insights, right? So in order to do that, I'll have to open up AD Manager Plus. As you can see, I already have a console opened here. And if I head into reports, you can see that I have reports for every object within Active Directory, right? And these reports are categorized object-wise and attribute-wise as well. For instance, if I head into user reports and head into users and groups, right? Let me just skip this. Reports, users and groups. And this will help me determine all the members of my groups in Active Directory, right? All I have to do is simply click plus, choose the groups that I want and hit generate, and we have the information right in front of us, right? And you see a special checkbox here called exclude nested groups. This will show you indirect or nested memberships as well. For instance, if you have a group A and a group B and a group C, right? And the group C is added to group B, right? So essentially what's going to happen here is that the group C, the members of group C would receive privileges in group A because group C is nested into group B, which is again nested into group A, right? So these are called indirect memberships, right? Which is something Active Directory does not let you do. Using the ADUC tool, like you can see here, I cannot find the indirect memberships of a user. It will just show me the direct memberships, right? But more often than not, organizations have indirect group memberships, and that needs to be monitored, and the tool does it for you, right? It's pretty straightforward. Simply select the domain, select the groups that you want, hit generate. You have the information in front of you. You can export the information. You can add or remove columns where you can show the attributes that you want in the end result of the report. And once that's done, you can also carry out management actions. For instance, if I want this user to not be a member of the admins group, I can simply select the user and carry out the action right here, the corrective action, meaning I can delete the user, I can disable the user, or I could remove the user from the group, right? So there are essentially reports for every object in your Active Directory. For instance, if I head back into reports, right? If I head into password reports right here, and if I head into password unchanged users, and let's just say last 30 days, right? You can choose the time frame that you want. And once I hit generate, this will show me all of my users and when they change the password, right? If you can recollect, I had to check this using the attribute editor tab in Active Directory, namely the password last set attribute, right? But AD Manager Plus, which is a component of 8360, automates the entire process for you, where it pushes out the information in the form of a report. And like always, the attributes that you see in the end result of the report can be edited, can be modified, and the report can be exported as well. Right? There are a lot of reports under passwords here. And if I head into user reports again, you have a lot of reports here as well. For instance, if I find out inactive users, this will show me all of my users who are enabled, but they haven't logged on in a long time. Right? This will help me determine accounts who are inactive or stale, and I can immediately select those accounts and carry out the management action. Right? For instance, let me quickly show you what just happened here. I have my users here, right? So I can simply select the user and carry out the management action, namely delete the user, disable the user, or move the user to another OU so we could use the account later. Right? So these reports right here will help you determine status of your Active Directory objects, right? So this in turn will help you determine the visibility that you need on your Active Directory objects without having to jump between multiple tools or windows, or without having to download scripts. This tool does it all for you, right? If I head into computer reports, I can find out my inactive computers. We've got something called Exchange reports here as well. That will help you determine the state of your on-premise Exchange servers if you have it installed. For instance, if I click on users without mailbox, this will show me all of my users who do not have a potential mailbox, right? And similarly, I've got terminal service reports. I've got NTFS reports, which will help me determine the file permissions that my user potentially has on all the Windows file servers in my organization. For instance, I can simply head into folders accessible by accounts. I can select an account. In this case, the account is going to be, let's say, Luna. Right, here we go. Simply select the account and I can check for the folders. I'm going to select my server here, which happens to be a DC. Simply select the server. You can specify a parent folder level, meaning you can find out permissions for subfolders in nested hierarchies as well. I can select a permission, let's say modify permission. And once I click generate, the users and the permissions on all folders in the path specified here will be displayed in the form of a report. Right? So that's NTFS reports for you to find out permissions on your files and servers. And last but not the least, we have our security reports. Security reports help you to determine permissions on your Active Directory objects, right? Objects such as groups or OUs. For instance, if I head into search permissions right here, I can select any object that I want from Active Directory. It could be a group, it could be an OU. So this is how it's going to be, right? So I can select any object here. I can specify a user or a computer or a group. I can specify the permissions that I want. For instance, I want to see which of the users have full permissions. And once I click generate, the information would be right in front of me, right? So this is essentially a permission search for all your on-premise objects, right? So I hope we've addressed the 3 parts that you need to gain visibility on, which is basically everything on your on-prem infrastructures. Number 1 is visibility on individual attribute values for objects, namely your users, your groups, your computers, your contacts, your GPOs. You can find out visibility. You can find out the state of your Active Directory objects and their attributes. You can find out information about your on-premise applications such as Exchange, like you can see right here. And you've got information about your Windows file servers and permissions on your security objects as well. Right? And not just that, we've got something called compliance reports here that will help you generate reports based on specific compliances. So these reports are all you need to satisfy the SOX compliance or the HIPAA compliance for that matter. Right? So that is the first step that I wanted you to do. Gain insights on these 3 parts: your object attribute values, your on-premise applications, and permissions on your file servers and your individual objects. Right? But this is just for on-prem. What about Azure Active Directory? Because I said that we would be addressing on-premise and Azure Active Directory as well, right? The only way for you to find out permissions or the state of your Azure Active Directory environment will be to use PowerShell, right? You'll have to download the command, you'll have to Google the command, run it from PowerShell, and you have the information in front of you. And I am going to repeat my same point again, where I say that PowerShell is increasingly being used as a cyber attack tool, right? Number one is that the code can trigger unwanted changes. Number two is that the code could potentially be malicious, could install ransomware that you may be unaware of. And number three, frankly, nobody likes scripting, right? So let's say if I need to find out a particular user or a particular attribute or a user with a combination of attributes on my on-premise infrastructure, I will have to manually write code for it. And considering our schedule, considering how busy system administrators are, this is not a feasible thing to do, right? And Azure Active Directory sadly does not offer a way to view reports from the GUI or from the Azure AD portal that you see right here. Right? The GUI offers no way for you to generate reports. Now, how do you decipher the state of your on-premise, of your Azure Active Directory, right? Like I said, you need to look into the attribute values of your Azure Active Directory. Your users who have passwords, users whose passwords haven't been changed in a long time, users who have licenses allocated, users who are members of privileged groups, users who have been granted privileged roles, devices that are registered in your Azure Active Directory, enterprise applications that are registered in your Active Directory, users that are synced from on-premise to Azure Active Directory, right? There are a number of things that you need to find out for you to gain visibility on your Azure Active Directory environment. And thankfully, 8360 can help you with that as well. So this is another component of 8360 called Office 365 Manager Plus, and this will help you obtain insight or visibility on your Azure Active Directory infrastructure. For instance, if I head into user reports right here, you can find out every detail, every teeny tiny detail about users in your Azure Active Directory. Okay. For instance, if I need to find out which of my users have never expiring passwords, this report will do it for you. If I need to find out which of my users have multi-factor authentication disabled, this report will do it for you. If I need to find out the registered devices in my Azure Active Directory and the owners of those devices, this report will do it for you. If I need to find group memberships, you got that here as well. If I need to find out which of my users have licenses, right, and which service is being used by that particular license, I can find that out as well using the reports that you can see right here. I apologize for the internet, it's a little bit slow here. So that's how it's going to work, right? AD Manager Plus for you to find out state of your Active Directory environments, visibility, insight, you name it, and Office 365 Manager Plus for you to find out information about your Azure Active Directory environment, right? And it's just not Azure Active Directory alone, but also your connected applications such as OneDrive, like you can see here, or Skype or Teams, right? You can also find out security reports wherein you can determine admin roles within Azure Active Directory or Exchange, right? So if you have Exchange Online hosted for that matter, you can head into mailbox reports and find out every bit of information you need about Exchange Online mailboxes. For instance, mailbox folder permissions. Which of my users can read the mailbox folder, can read the mails in that mailbox folder, right? Again, there are a number of things that you will need to look into. It depends on your organization and depends into what part of your hybrid environment you need visibility into, but we have reports that will help you gain instant visibility on the bulk objects scattered across your hybrid infrastructure, right? These reports, like I said, can help you enforce security, can help you watch resource consumption. For instance, number of licenses consumed, number of mailboxes consumed, the storage quota on the OneDrive application, right? Reports such as this will help you watch the resource consumption and ensure that resources are used optimally. And of course, we've got compliance-based reports for Azure Active Directory as well. So if you can see, if I head into compliance right here, you can see that we have reports for SOX, HIPAA, PCI DSS, and these are customized reports that will help you satisfy that compliance regulation. So you can be ready when your compliance officer come knocking. Right? So that's the first step that I want for you to do. Gain visibility on your infrastructure. That's your Active Directory, namely your on-premise infrastructure and Azure Active Directory. and we've got reports that will help you do it. Number two is to centralize management actions. Right? One thing that I kept saying from the start was the absence of a unified interface or a centralized interface. Right? And the second question of any IAM approach is, are there sufficient methods to manage access? Right? The first question was to find out if the right users have access to the right resources and fix them just in case they were wrong, which we did with the help of reports and inbuilt management actions. And the second step was to ensure if there are sufficient management methods, if there are sufficient management practices or systems in place that will help you manage and govern access across your Active Directory and Azure Active Directory environment. Right? And again, the limitations of native tools here is that you will need to jump between multiple windows. Let's say I need to let's say a simple task, right, such as user provisioning or user offboarding, right, across on-premise and the cloud. Let's say I need to do that right away. How would I do that? I will have to first create users on my on-prem Active Directory, create mailboxes for on-premise Exchange servers, and again, create an account for that particular user in Azure Active Directory and Office 365. And let's face it, when it comes to huge numbers, such as 50 or 100 users, the process becomes very complex, right? And number two is that the native tools are restricted in their capabilities. For instance, the file permission report again, right? If I have to find out permissions on all files and folders in my organization, how would I do it? I will have to right click on the folder, check the security tab for permissions, right? I would have to repeat this process for all files and folders in my organization, right? And let me just give you another example. Let's say you want to delegate a user. You want to create a help desk technician that can manage Active Directory and Azure Active Directory or Office 365. How would you do that? How would you ensure that only the authorized user is doing the work? And how would you monitor that user's accesses? Like I said, the native tools do not work so well in this case. For instance, if I have to delegate control for Active Directory and Office 365, I can't use the Active Directory delegation of control wizard, right? The Azure AD role-based access control cannot be used to delegate control on my on-premise Active Directory. And the Office 365 roles cannot be used to delegate controls in either of the environment either, right? And bear in mind that each of these tools come in with their own limitations. For instance, I can use this tool to delegate permissions on my on-premise infrastructure, right? But do I have a tool to view the permissions that are delegated? No, the only way to do that would be to head into Active Directory, right click on a user, select the properties, and click the security tab to find out the permissions that were delegated by the administrator to the end users. If I use Azure AD role-based access control, I can delegate control over resources within Azure Active Directory, but this has its own limitations. For instance, there is no time-based access. I cannot give a user privileged access for a specified amount of time, right? Or I cannot set up multi-factor authentication when a user does a privileged job or a job that is delegated to him or her by the administrator. Office 365 roles, the same issue comes in again, where there is no central place to give permissions. For instance, if I need to give permissions to my Office 365 users, the only way to do this would be like this. Head into Office 365, users, active users, select the user, right? Roles, and assign the role. You will have to repeat this process for all users in your Office 365, right? And the age-old problem comes in again, where there is no centralized place where I can view the delegated roles that were assigned to my users, and there is no centralized place where I can revoke, right, the delegated access or ungive or ungrant the delegated access that was given to my end users. Right, these are just a few limitations over the native tools. But with AD 360, you can delegate permissions across Active Directory, Azure Active Directory, and Office 365, right? The roles are extremely granular, right? You can delegate permissions for your Active Directory, Office 365, and your Azure Active Directory as well, just from this unified interface without having to jump in between tools. And what's more, we've got detailed reports about every activity. For instance, if I head into delegation right here, where I've delegated my users' roles, right? You can see that I have a marketing user who's delegated a privileged role, right? So if I head into audit report, I can find out all the activities that were performed by my users. I can simply go back in time, hit go, and the information would be right in front of me, right? And I can also find out the roles that were delegated by me as an administrator to my end user, right? So the thing I'm trying to put forth here is that you have a centralized interface to delegate access, to ungrant or to revoke access, and even to monitor the things that are being done by your users using the privilege that you just gave them as an administrator, right? The next thing 8360 can help you with is unifying or integrating management actions across your infrastructure. For instance, if you need to provision 100 users, the example that I just stated before, right? 8360 can help you automate that entire process. For instance, let me quickly show you what's happening here. I have a CSV file with a list of employees, right? And I feed the CSV file into 8360, and 8360 will create user accounts in Office 365, Exchange, on-prem Exchange servers if I have them, G Suite, and more, right? So this is just one console that you need to manage actions. We also have the ability to manage permissions across all files and folders in an organization. Again, the unified console comes in again. For instance, if I head into 8360 right here, if you can remember, we saw something called NTFS reports, right? This will help me determine permissions for all files and folders in my organization. If I head into the management tab, we've got something called file server management, where I can configure all file servers right here. And if I head into modify NTFS permissions, I can modify the permissions for my files and folders across my organization. Simply select the folder, specify the permission, hit modify, and you're good to go. If you already have a folder with the required permissions, you can simply copy the permissions from that existing folder and watch that everything in 8360 has a unique feature built into it. For instance, you can see these checkboxes right here, right? So if I click on this checkbox, what it does is it will remove all permissions on a particular file or folder, and it will restructure them in the way that I've specified permissions here, right? So using this one tab alone, you can restructure or you can redesign permissions across your files and folders. And not just this, if I head into the workflow tab, like you can see here, and jump into create request, right? You can now see that I have something called set folder permissions, where here you can set folder permissions based on a specified duration. So I can select folder, I can select a user, and I can set the permission that I want, and I can also specify the duration. Right? If you can recollect, the one thing that I said earlier was the absence of setting time-based permissions in on-prem and Azure Active Directory, but 8360 can help you with that. Be it file or folder permissions, or be it group memberships, you can set time-based permissions as well, right? You can simply specify the duration, and once the duration is done, the user or the group will automatically be revoked the permission that's being assigned. Right, so that's just something else that I wanted to say. And the third thing is you can also manage passwords for your hybrid environment using 8360, wherein you can enforce a singular password policy, right? This password policy will work for your on-premise and your cloud applications as well. Let me quickly show you how that works. If I head into my console right here, you can now see that I have a password policy defined. And if I go down here, and if I select, oops, right, and if I select password sync/single sign-on, you can see all the applications for which passwords can be set up, right? And these passwords are secure because you have a password policy that is enforced here, right? And the password policy can be combined with single sign-on for multiple cloud applications. If you have custom applications, you can add in a new custom applications here as well, right? Now, bear in mind that all of these applications are SAML supported applications alone, right? So then another important part of an IAM was to eliminate inconsistent passwords or have a uniform password policy, and 8360 can help you with that as well, where you have one universal password policy for your applications, either on-premise or cloud, right? And the best part here is that these password policies work from the native end as well. For instance, if your users in Active Directory decide to change a password, the password policy would kick in right there, right? Or if your administrator decides to reset a password using the ADUC tool, the password policy that you've specified here will kick in from the native end as well, right? And not just this, you can also set up two-factor authentication in 8360. This is how it would work, right? So your users essentially log on to your systems. They key in the password, and once they click enter, you can now see that the user receives a notification on his or her mobile phone. And once the user accepts, right, the user will then be allowed to log on to the domain. Right? So this is a two-factor authentication method that was set up using the AD self-service plus mobile application. But then again, we offer multiple choices for you here as well. If I head into multi-factor authentication, you can see that there are close to 14 methods for which you can set up multi-factor authentication for your on-premise users and your cloud applications as well. Right? So what do I mean by this? Right? What do I mean by all of this password information? Your users will just adhere to one single password policy across applications, right? The password policy that you have defined in 8360. And once they agree to the password policy, and once they undergo the second factor of authentication, that's all they need to do. They will have seamless access across multiple applications, right? And again, this works from your on-premise native password changes or resets as well. And the password change will be reflected across all your cloud applications. The third important and the last part of an efficient IAM solution is to enforce security. Are there systems in place to monitor the access? The first part was visibility on on-premise and Azure AD. The second part was setting up efficient management actions, which we just did. The third part is to ensure security. Right? Now, I won't get into details about the limitations of native auditing, but here are a few. Right? Number one is, be it on-premise or Azure Active Directory, there are a large volume of logs produced. Let me quickly illustrate using an example. Here is my VM and here is my event viewer. Right? This is where I monitor access for my Azure Active Directory environment. And you can see that there are about 13,000 logs. Right? And only me has access to this VM. Just me, and there are 13,000 logs. Imagine this on a scale of an enterprise environment or of an organization where there are 100 to 50 to 1,000 employees. Right? There are many other limitations as well, such as these logs have low log retention time. You cannot audit Azure and Active Directory from one single console, the absence of centralization all over again. The logs have poor filtering capabilities. For instance, if I need to find out which of my users failed to log on at so-and-so time, I cannot do that. There are no predefined compliance reports, right? And once, if you encounter anything malicious using the native auditing tools, you cannot set up mitigation capabilities, right? And the fact that you cannot set up mitigation capabilities comes in cohesion with the fact that you can't configure alerting, right? So that's a large volume of logs, a low log retention time. For instance, Azure Active Directory only has a 60-day log retention time. You cannot audit hybrid and Azure from a single console. The logs cannot be filtered for you to find out details about suspicious events. There are no mitigation capabilities. If you find anything going wrong, if you find anything suspicious, you cannot set up a mitigation activity. And last but not the least, you cannot configure alerts. Now, this might be like a lot of information. Let me just give a small example here. Let's say your organization is subject to a brute force attack and the attacker has gained access, right? So how would you go about dealing with it? 8360 can help you with that. Let me quickly show you how that works. If I head into 8360 right here, and let me just open up my console. can see this is the auditing part of 8360. And once I log in, just give this a second. I apologize, my home internet is a little bit slow today. And I head into reports right here. As you can see, I can find out activities. I can perform change monitoring of all the activities happening on my on-premise and cloud infrastructure, namely Azure Active Directory. For instance, if I need to find out which of my users failed their logons on Azure Active Directory, I have a user logon report here. And that's further categorized into logon failures where I have all the information right here, right? I can also click on details and check if there is a potential process, an application, a service, or anything else that may have triggered the logon failure, right? For instance, if a user has older credentials in a service running somewhere, the service will still be trying the older credentials, but in reality, the user's password may have been updated, right? So this report right here will help you determine logon failures across Active Directory. And like I said, a unified interface where you can watch for logon activity across Azure Active Directory as well, right? And also the applications in Azure Active Directory. The auditing features span massively where you can find out information about auditing, about various Active Directory objects. The difference between this and AD Manager Plus is that this is a change monitoring solution, right? For instance, if a user is added to a security group, right, the report will immediately show this to you, right? If your files or folders have been modified, if your files or folders have been copied or permissions have been changed, this report will immediately show that to you. If your user is potentially using a tool like PowerShell to perform attacks, you've got something called PowerShell Auditing here that will capture any malicious PowerShell activities, right? So this will monitor for any changes that are happening on your infrastructure, any critical changes, and you can head into configuration, create an alert profile, and set up an alert, right? The alert could be threshold based, meaning if there are more than 10 malicious logon activities, 10 logon failures happening within a minute, it could be a password attack attempt, and you can immediately alert the admin via an email, via an SMS, or you could execute a script. Right? Now, what does the script do? The script acts as a remedial measure or as a mitigation action. For instance, if your user, if a particular user is performing a password attack or a brute force attack on your environment, the alert that you've set up here, right? There are more than 10 events happening within a minute, and the user has the same name. And let's say it's also happening outside of business hours, right? Probably in the night sometime. The admin will be alerted via email, via SMS, and the script will be executed, a remedial script, a mitigation script that will basically lock the user or log off the user or stop the user from performing any further activity by disabling the user's account. Right, so AD Audit Plus right here will help you change, monitor your Azure Active Directory and your Active Directory environments, right? Which is again a component of AD 360. So a quick summary of what we saw today. I know this was a lot of information, so quickly summarizing, we saw the importance of IAM in Active Directory and Azure Active Directory, right? And then we saw a few limitations of IAM strategies in Active Directory and Azure Active Directory. And last but not the least, we employed a phased approach where first we gain visibility on our infrastructure. What's happening on our infrastructure? Azure Active Directory and connected applications, Active Directory, on-premise applications, file servers, and data, right? So we were able to gain visibility on our Active Directory, connected applications and file servers, and Azure Active Directory and connected applications as well. Once we gained the required visibility, the next step was to streamline management activities, right? And this is performing or streamlining or integrating management activities across your hybrid infrastructure, namely Active Directory and Azure Active Directory. And last but not the least, we set up security. We set up change monitoring and alerts to watch for suspicious or malicious activities that are happening in your Active Directory or Azure Active Directory environment, so you can be on your feet at all times, right? So that's 3 simple steps: visibility to understand what's happening, management activities to streamline activities and to fix any mismanaged errors that could have come in your hybrid infrastructure, and last but not the least is to enforce security and alerts with powerful auditing capabilities, all in AD360. Check out AD360, a single console, again, a unified, a centralized console for efficient identity and access management for your Active Directory and your Azure Active Directory environments. Now, before I end this webinar, I will be pushing out a quick poll. If you could help me out with the answers, that would be really helpful. All right, so I'll just push out 2 quick questions on your screen. If you can help me out with the answers to the questions, that would be really helpful. Right now, you will find a question flash across your screen. I'm quickly going to launch the poll. If you can help me out with the answers, that would be really helpful. Just a few seconds, and I promise I will be out of your hair. Thank you so much for your responses. Thank you. Just a few more minutes, and I promise I will be out of your hair. Thank you so much for your responses, guys. I would love to hear your thoughts. I honestly hope you found this session informative. I tried to cram in as much as information as I could. IAM is a huge topic, a vast topic that has to be covered. And I really hope you found this session informative. If you would let me know your thoughts, that would be really great. Your thoughts, your suggestions, thank you so much for your responses. Just a few more seconds, and I promise I will be out of your hair. Thank you so much for your responses, guys. All right, perfect. Now, I hope you found the session informative. I understand that it was a bit detailed, but do not worry, we would be sending you the slide deck as soon as we can, right? Just within the next day or something, you would be receiving the recording as well as the slide deck to your email IDs. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me on abi@manageengine.com. That's abi@manageengine.com, and I would be more than happy to help you out. I would be here for the next 10 to 15 minutes. So if you have any questions, please use the chat box in front of you and keep punching in your questions, and I would be more than happy to help you out. You can use the Q&A tab if you have any questions, and I'll be happy to take them. And if you have questions later in the day, just drop me an email and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. But until then, thank you so much for listening. I hope you found this session informative. We covered all the critical aspects of IAM today, and I look forward to seeing you in my next session. Thank you so much and have a wonderful day today.